Al, at the end of our first session with you, we had gotten to the point where you had moved from Jersey City to the suburbs in Bergen County, at least what were suburbs then, now are much more developed. But what was it like joining the many New Jerseyans who had sort of followed the same path, moving from the city to the suburbs?
I found it a change in several interesting ways. The first is that your day-to-day living was much easier. Things were within grasp from the standpoint of shopping and doing the normal everyday things that one would want to do. And the second thing was that the commute for me, I was still practicing law in Jersey City, was a little easier. Despite the fact that I lived in Jersey City, but the roadwork network was beginning to manifest itself with the extension of the turnpike northward, and the traveling part of it became an occurrence that really was not at all burdensome in contrast with some of my New York brethren.
Talk a little bit about the politics and the differences between Hudson and Bergen counties at that time.
The politics was remarkably different because I went from what was essentially a completely Democratic area, Hudson County and Jersey City specifically, into a community, Tenafly, which was wholly under the control of Republicans. At that point, it didn't make that much difference to me because politics at the local level was not one of my prime interests. But when one does settle down in a Republican area or an area different from your prior political environment, you're dealing with neighbors who don't think the way you do, and it was a very interesting metamorphosis for me.
Did you try to change their opinions in any way, or just let it lie?
No, at the time, having come from the maelstrom of Hudson County politics, as I described earlier in our interview, it was a phase of my life that I was not deeply involved in when I first moved to Bergen County. I had determined to pay more attention to my law practice and to just settle down in the new environment.
Well, how did things change, and how did you get drawn back into politics?
Essentially, it was because of my wife, who at that point at least was something more of a political activist than I was. She became a Democratic committee woman, and from that arose a need to find some people to debate some local issues, and she was kind enough to volunteer my services without my knowing it. And after that came once I got slowly, within about 3 or so years after I moved to Bergen County, more involved in local affairs and political life once again, that I began to become the political activist once more, and ran twice, unsuccessfully each time, for the local council as a Democrat.
Were there specific issues that provoked your wife to get involved in politics in Bergen County, or was it more generally a feeling she wanted to be a participant and a player?
She was more a participant in the overall scheme of things, not necessarily looking to local issues. But it did happen, as with most of the Bergen County communities in that period of time. If you'll recall, I moved to Bergen County in 1965. There was still plenty of land available for development. Issues of local development were primary, and how and when, under what circumstances that development was to take place became the political issues of the time.
Mm-hmm. And sort of what was your take on the sort of development process that was taking place in Bergen?
It was somewhat chaotic. Obviously, there are zoning laws that had their role to play in governing the way in which development was going to proceed. But slowly but surely, without thinking through in an overall plan basis, the available land got to be used up, and that proceeded in a rapid fashion over the next decade, to the point where today there's hardly an open piece of land left in Bergen County.
Who were the chief contacts and sort of backers other than your wife that you dealt with in sort of returning to your political role?
The principal mentor, if one could phrase it in those terms, for me was a man that I knew back from my Jersey City days, and that was Matthew Feldman. At the time I moved into Bergen County, Matty was the county Democratic leader. And we maintained a somewhat distant contact even when I was still back in Jersey City. But then when I moved into Tenafly, we resumed more frequent contact, and he knew of the fact, obviously, that I had run for office in the municipality.
And he was the one who urged you to run for elected office in Bergen?
Well, not necessarily. I don't think that he played any kind of role in my 2 runs for municipal council. But obviously he was watching what was going on as the county leader. Because one evening, I recall so clearly, he had an intermediary, one of my neighbors in Tenafly, call me and asked me if I wanted to be on the ticket for the state assembly, and that started the state involvement.
Who was the intermediary?
It was a woman, and I honestly don't recall her name right now. I haven't seen her that frequently in recent years.
What were your considerations in deciding to sort of accept that invitation, given that you had decided to focus on your law practice? And I assume part of the balance in making your decision was whether, again, you would have the time and energy to pursue both a public and private career.
There is a virulent disease that's entitled a political virus that lies quietly at times within one's body. And that political virus, I found I still had, even though I had, as I expressed before, a desire to have a few years of quiet and attention to my professional development. And that was beginning to show fruits. When the call came, as I've just described it, I was ready to get back into public life.
Did you think it would hurt or help your law practice?
I never approached it in those terms. I never thought in terms of political advancement as providing an avenue to professional success.
Was your wife, even though she was somewhat of a political activist herself, supportive, or was she concerned about the time and the travel to Trenton if you were elected and the sort of toll on the family and private time?
She was always supportive. The matter of the time devoted to public life was something that you never can plot ahead of time with exactitude. You can guess that it's going to take a fair amount of your time, but you never really know and understand until you become actively involved and remain in public life over a period of time, as I eventually did. And then the reality struck. It still didn't diminish my wife's absolute unvarying support for whatever I wanted to do politically.
We'll talk a little bit more about the allocating time between the public and private roles. In addition to the time as an elected state legislator, going back and forth to official sessions and committee meetings, you're also become a target for invitations to all sorts of dinner fundraisers, nonprofit groups who want your appearance. How much of a toll is that at that time, and I guess bringing it now, has it gotten worse or better for contemporary legislators?
I think it's gotten more intense than ever before, but obviously it existed even in the early 1970s when I first went into the legislature. And it does become a difficult balancing act, maintaining responsibilities at home, including a relatively young family, although by that time, in 1971, 2 of my 3 children already were off into colleges. So there was just a child remaining at home who was going through the Tenafly public school system. And it is not an easy task because the demands upon you are really enormous. And people don't realize, let's say the electorate doesn't realize how much time is allocated on a daily basis, even though you only meet in the legislative session approximately 40 times a year, plus maybe committee meetings as an extra. But beyond that, we had legislative offices that periodically we had to visit and meet with constituents and go to the very types of things you mentioned, dinners and demands for speeches and that sort of thing that are inherent in the public life.
Did you tolerate that part of the job or enjoy it?
I enjoyed that. Speaking in front of groups, I found was something that I thoroughly enjoyed, and I hope to some extent mastered, in addressing audience concerns and in developing certain areas of specialty where I felt I had something to impart to the audience.
Skipping back a little bit to the mid-'60s, when you again sort of renewed your political career in a new county, Bergen County. At that time also the Democratic Party, both nationally and to some extent in New Jersey, was being split over the Vietnam War and the positions within the party, either supporting the Johnson administration's position or moving toward the sort of Gene McCarthy wing of the party. What was your personal position at that time?
My personal position was a mixture of things. I was not a Eugene McCarthy advocate. I never believed that the way in which you maintain some directional control over a political system is by taking fringe candidates and trying to ride them into an area where you feel that the party is not going in the right path. I was against involvement in the Vietnam War from the very beginning. I had tried to educate myself, not knowing very much about the country initially, by doing some reading, and particularly I was influenced in a major way by a book by a French journalist who was killed in Vietnam called Bernard Fall, who wrote about the French experience and their defeat at Dien Bien Phu, and how France and its troops were looked upon as colonial masters that the Vietnamese people wanted to get rid of. And the more you read about it, the more you became concerned that America was just replacing France as a colonial power, or at least in the eyes of the Vietnamese. And however we protested that we just were fighting communism, from the standpoint of the man on the street, you got the very distinct notion that they were fighting a foreign occupier, and that would have been disastrous for us. So I was against the war from day one.
Was that more a sort of a personal conviction, or did you take any public stances on the war?
No, I didn't take any public stances. This was just my own personal conviction about it.
Were there people within New Jersey in the party then trying to recruit you into some of these anti-war organizations? Do you recall?
No, not to the best of my recollection. Nobody tried to recruit me into, and I wouldn't have joined, as I say, these fringe groups.
Well, let's go again back into the 70s again, your first election to the Assembly. How difficult was it to get that nomination? Was it pretty much unopposed within the party in terms of your selection, or was there some concern about you being relatively new to the county, or they hadn't paid your dues within the county at least? And what was the election campaign like? Well,
the matter of my being a relative newcomer into Bergen County politics never came up. My running mate was Byron Bear, whom I had not known prior to our running in tandem in what was then the and I guess today is the 37th Legislative District. When I got the call, as I say, from Matty Feldman, I really had to educate myself about the district lines and the personalities and people involved in politics in the various communities that constituted the 37th District. So I was really starting from scratch. But to provide context, there was to the best of my recollection, no opposition to the selection of Bear and myself as the Assembly candidates. And part of the reason, I think, was that there were new district lines that just went into effect in that first election, which was held in 1971. And there were no incumbents running in that race. The two Republicans, one of whom was Austin Volk, the mayor of Englewood, and the second I don't recall anymore, were not office holders when they ran against us. So it was like all of us starting afresh in this one geographical area. And as a result, there was really no opposition at the initial stages, the primary stage, to my going ahead into the campaign.
So there were no elected officials, mayors, freeholders, whomever, who were seen as potential pretenders to the Assembly vacancies?
No, because I think that maybe they were too educated. I was undereducated. They were overeducated about the demographics of the legislative district. And Bergen County at that time, one has to remember, was a heavily Republican county. And it was only later on that it evolved to what it is today, sitting here in 2006 into what has been a majority Democratic party, Democratic area.
Well, in those days, what did you do to sort of do research on the demographics and the voters, particularly in a new district? You sort of knew in general, I guess, as to how the registration patterns were by municipality, but what was the type of preparation you did for a campaign in those days?
To some extent, I relied upon Bear because he was far more active and had lived in Bergen County far longer than I had. And he had a statistical bent so that he knew the population down to the last tenth of the various municipalities in which we were running. And there was some amount of guidance that came from him. And of course, at the county level itself, Matty Feldman, having had a personal relationship with me, was also immensely helpful in organizing the campaign, telling us where to go, what to do, all of the minutiae that go along with running.
Who were the other key people in your campaign?
In that first campaign, Loretta Weinberg, who is now a state senator from that same district, was our campaign manager, and she had a good political head. She was very helpful in knowing where to go, what to do, how to organize the various little events that go along with campaigning. And
what made that campaign successful?
It's very hard to say in retrospect, certainly not the force of my personality or anything like it, or the emergence of any particular issue. But it just happened that in working out the district lines, there was a fairly even balance between Democrats and Republicans on registration. And whatever the cause was, and it's very hard for me to say in retrospect what the cause was, but whatever, we had a pretty good idea of the nature of the population we were appealing to, and I felt very comfortable in taking whatever positions I felt were important in running that campaign, without fear that I was going to aggrieve too many people and cause a loss to the ticket.
Do you remember at that time, how did the redistricting process go? Was there a commission? How was the process at that point?
The commission that we are now used to, that has been in existence over the last several decades, was not in existence at that time. And I think that it was simply a legislative enactment that did it. In other words, there was no prior commission, as we have now, of 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, trying to work out the district lines. It was done, I think, perhaps through the technocrats working within the Office of Legislative Services in the light of the one-man, one-vote U.S. Supreme Court ruling that then obtained over, I think it was around that time, that then obtained, but in any event, the whole idea was to get as even a balance among populations within the county in the new lines.
And what was the party majority composition at that time in each house?
As a result of the 71 election, the result of that election was that the Senate remained in control of the Republicans, and I don't recall what the margin was, but it was at least 4 to 5 votes, if I remember rightly. And in the Assembly, we ended up in a dead heat. There were 40 Democrats, 39 Republicans, and 1 independent.
And talk a little bit about how that dead heat sort of resulted in terms of the leadership in the Assembly.
It caused a major leadership fight. Control of the Assembly was obviously very important because Governor Cahill, a Republican, was still in office in the 71 election and had 2 years more to run on his term. And if he lost control of the Assembly, it would have posed problems for him that probably exceeded the problems he ultimately did face. And what occurred was that given the impasse, the inability of one party or the other as a result of the election outcome to organize the Assembly, there were negotiations going on of the fiercest kind, backdoor, backroom, among various different parts of the Democratic Party with the Republican Party, and the end result of it was, as we all know now, a deal having been made by the Republicans and their leadership, which included Tom Kean and Dick DeCourt. Dick DeCourt was the floor leader for the Republicans. Tom Kean became the Assembly Speaker, and they entered into an agreement, a nefarious deal as we called it at that time, with the Hudson County Democrats in order to have the votes to organize the Assembly.
What was your understanding of the quid pro quo for that deal?
There were chairmanships of committees given to at least one, maybe more, of the Hudson Democrats. And beyond that, there were pieces of legislation that Hudson County was very much interested in that they were promised that they would have put through. And as matters developed during the course of that legislative campaign, there were things that were indigenous to the Hudson County political scene, where there was always, at least at that time and even today, a lot of infighting within the Democratic Party, different factions fighting with one another. And one of the factions at that point was led by David Friedland from the Assembly side, very articulate but a very complex individual who unfortunately ended up in jail for other reasons. David Friedland was using the Assembly to create committees that would conduct investigations that would be helpful to his faction in Hudson County. And he did that with the support of the majority Republicans.
For the Democrats in the Assembly outside Hudson County, what was your reaction to this deal, and when did you sort of first get wind of it?
Well, it took about a week or so after the normal organization, the time for organization of the Assembly, for this to gel. The reaction, predictably, was that the rest of the Democrats were utterly outraged and barred the Hudson County Democrats' participation in caucus meetings, at least initially anyway. Eventually that kind of petered out, and a sort of peace was made with at least some of the Hudson County Democrats, including Joe LaFonte, who eventually became the Speaker.
But I guess the deal was made before the other Democrats had time to scuttle it. Is that true?
Oh, yes. We were a relatively freshman class of some size, and I guess you would have to say that in the onset of 1971's organization of the legislature, there were more of us who were new to that game, new to the negotiation, new to the various factions and how to put them together to create areas of control over the process than would normally otherwise be the case. And part of the reason for that was that this was around the time, it was after the 1970 presidential, it was 72 presidential election, but there was some amount of disaffection with the national leadership. And there were matters that were beginning to gel in a way that made us very experienced in a compressurized setting, but when we were going through this initial phase of matters, we were like babes in the woods.
What was your personal feeling, and to the extent you feel comfortable in generalizing, of the other Assembly Democrats toward Tom Kaine's role in this deal?
The attitude was, of course, that he was a part of a nefarious agreement with Hudson Democrats, and that even though he and Dick DeCourt, for whom I had enormous admiration, a very capable leader and a very bright man, and potentially a governor of New Jersey had he lived long enough to do it, that Kaine, coming of that same faction of the rather liberal Republican Party, that was when Clifford Case was a United States Senator, a Republican who was quite a liberal individual, that Kaine had sold his soul to the devil. And that was a stigma that I think stuck with Governor Kaine for some period of time thereafter. I always found him to be a most pleasant and very capable and charitable individual. But it was hard to forgive what he had done at that point.
Did you have some grudging respect for the shrewdness of the Republican deal?
One had to have, purely in political terms, an amount of respect for the way in which they carved out their ability to take control, absolutely.
To your knowledge, did the deal initiate on the Republican side or the Hudson County Democratic side?
I have no idea who initiated it, but given past history, I would say that there were soundings that came from the Hudson Democrats.
Perhaps David Freeland in particular?
Yes. I think he had had some personal relationship, perhaps, with Dick DeCourt prior to these events in 1971, because I think Freeland already was in the legislature by that time. He had probably been elected in the 1969 election.
Well, given the fact that the Assembly gets organized with a speaker that Democrats sort of recognize as a minority speaker, I guess, how did you relate in terms of the official rules and process in the Assembly? Was there some effort to undercut the Speaker's authority, to raise points of order, to make it difficult for this leader that you felt was put there by stealth?
Unfortunately for Democrats, they ordinarily do not operate that way. That would be the political way to go. And probably in the last analysis, maybe even the most sensible way to go if you want to achieve your own program. But no, we did not do that. We respected his position as Speaker. We tried to work with him, and as a matter of fact, with the Republican administration in some of the most critical issues that came before that session of the legislature, specifically the income tax program that Governor Cahill had advanced.
Talk more specifically about the income tax and who was on which side, both within the Democrats and within the Republicans. It was a Cahill administration proposal, but many Republicans were vigorously opposed to that. But give us your own recollection of who was standing where.
Well, let me start with the Republicans. Among the Republicans, of course, their leadership stayed with Governor Cahill and a handful of others. I think that there were, if memory serves, there were, when the vote came on the Cahill tax package. There were 9 Republicans that voted for it and 15 Democrats. It only got about the 24 votes, that, as I recall the numbers at this point. Among the 15 Democrats, you had at least 6 to 7 that came from, or maybe more, that came from the urban areas. And then there were several others like myself who came from suburban districts, but who felt that this was important for the state and treated it as an issue that had statewide implications. By that time, the Robinson-Cahill education finance case had been decided in the lower court, in the trial court by Judge Ted Botter, and that the only way to finance what was being demanded of us by the judiciary would be by adopting a broad-based tax. At that time, we had a sales tax in place. I don't recall whether it was 3 or 4% that had been adopted by Governor Hughes during his administration. But clearly it was insufficient to fund the educational needs of the state. So that there was that number of people who stuck with the governor on that program.
Given that you were representing a district that was somewhat balanced in terms of party registration, and that you really hadn't had an awful lot of time to cement your sort of incumbency in the Assembly, did you view the vote for the tax as a possible career-threatening move in terms of your electoral career?
I don't want to sound pompous, and I don't want to sound as if I had made these idealistic decisions. I had always been in favor of a broader-based tax for the state. We were archaic in the way in which our tax system operated in the 60s and 70s, even with the adoption of a minimal sales tax. So it was a decision that I had come upon early on, having an interest in public affairs, and that seemed to me to be a precondition to bring New Jersey into the modern era in a whole variety of ways, not only education. And I did not think of that vote in terms of whether it was going to help or hurt my career. When I went into public office, I went in with the premise that I would vote on matters depending upon what I thought was the right way to go. And it's not that I did not accede to political pressures at times. I certainly did. But when it came to matters as fundamental as tax policy, I just had made a determination long before I got into the Assembly, if I ever had the chance, that was the route I would go in. There was also, and I am candid to say it now, as well as at that time, in my district, I was hurt less by a vote in favor of an income tax than some of my colleagues were in some of their districts, suburban districts. And what I mean by that is that the demographics of my district showed many, many people, good portion of the voting population, working in New York, living in New Jersey, working in New York, paying New York City and New York State taxes. And they would be getting a credit for any New Jersey taxes paid against those foreign jurisdiction taxes. And as a result, they were not going to be really hurt. As a matter of fact, they may even have benefited in some, depending upon the amount of tax they had to pay, may even have been benefited from the institution of a tax program in the state, while at the same time getting the benefit of money, more money for the schools, more money for infrastructure in the cities, and so on. So that I did not think I would be politically hurt anyway, no matter what I believed before.
Despite the perception among a lot of voters that this was a proposal to bail out the urban schools and the cities, that didn't sort of weigh in the calculus that you sort of had to make in terms of your vote?
It weighed in the calculus, but I felt that first, the population of my district was a well-educated population, with most of the people that I had to face at election time understanding the value of education in a more global sense. How it affects the amount of crime that we had to deal with, how it affects the prosperity of the individuals involved, that a good education was a foundational matter that should not have been tainted by political considerations. With that in mind, the fact that I was able to appeal on an intellectual level to people in my district, making that type of argument, left me with a comfortable feeling that it was not going to hurt me politically.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Cahill administration failed in its efforts to push its tax proposal, which also led to a split within the Republican Party that later came back to haunt Governor Cahill's re-election campaign. What were the other issues that you dealt with in the Assembly, both for and against the Cahill administration?
The other issues really were so subordinate to the tax and finance issues that it's hard to think in terms now of other matters that might have been hot-button issues where we had tough things going. I will say that I felt very much in tune with the direction in which Governor Cahill was going. I think he was a serious man who was trying to do an honest job, and it was a shame that for those reasons he was knocked out by Charles Sandman in the gubernatorial primary later on. But there were other issues that related to environmental concerns. There was the onset of several pieces of environmental legislation that was put forth by the Cahill administration, again, with which I felt quite comfortable. And I can't say that there were any pieces of legislation that come to mind where I had any real ideological difference with that administration.
What about the Cahill proposal to develop the Meadowlands and to solicit the football giants to move to New Jersey?
I had been looking at the Meadowlands in its pristine state for many, many years because it abutted, well, it's in Hudson County as well as Bergen. And we used to just generically call it the Meadows. So looking at that and seeing that there was nothing going on led to the belief that with the burgeoning population all over the Northeast and specifically in our sections of New Jersey, there was going to have to be something done with the development of that area. And I must say that I looked upon fixing the New York Giants or a sports complex as the triggering point for development made sense because nobody else at that point was willing to come in and start development. A lot of the land in the Meadowlands was held in the hands of a couple of families, and those families unfortunately started fighting within themselves over what development projects ought to move ahead. And with that kind of history, it seemed to me that it made logical sense for Governor Cahill's suggestions to come to fruition.
The initial planning concepts for the Meadowlands envisaged a much more sort of mixed use, sort of almost a new city in the area, triggered, as you said, by the development of the Giants Stadium. Looking back over the time, that really hasn't quite happened. It's been mostly commercial, office, retail development. Did we make mistakes, or do you think things sort of went the way the market would push them in any event?
I believe that the infrastructure costs of developing the Meadowlands for relatively intense residential development were such that unless you had a significant governmental subsidy, developers could not fiscally make a go of it because of the nature of the land or the swamps that they had to drain out in order to have available building lots. So I don't think you can fairly characterize what didn't happen as a missed opportunity, because the opportunity never really arose, as is still the case today.
Another problem besetting the Cahill administration were a series of scandals that came to light. In terms of sort of the Democrats in the Assembly and in the legislature generally, did you sort of see this as something that may lead to a Democratic victory over Governor Cahill in the '73 election?
What was happening in New Jersey had its counterpart eventually, as we all know, in the Watergate scandals at the federal level, which in turn, I think, led to Governor Burns' election by a significant margin. And yes, the Democrats looked upon it maybe in a holier-than-thou way, but looked upon what was happening. I think it was Cahill's Secretary of State that was implicated in some wrongdoing, as an opportunity to take control of the state and the legislature for the first time since DeQ's middle 60s years.
As that 1973 primary campaign started, there were a couple thoughts of Bergen County favorite sons getting into the race. What was your perspective in terms of who you might personally support as the nominee, and how did you finally wind up?
I don't recall looking upon any of my colleagues or any of the people in Bergen County that I was involved with politically as being viable gubernatorial candidates. I didn't have anybody in particular in mind, but I had known a little bit about Brendan Burns' background and ongoing career at that point, because I knew a couple of his classmates at Harvard. I think it was Harvard Law School, yeah. And they had nothing but good things to say about Brendan.
Who were they?
A fellow named Bill Feinberg, who was a lawyer in Bayonne, and I don't recall the other guy the other person that I spoke to, but they knew Brendan and had high marks for him as a person and as a potential candidate. And also I knew something of his reputation on the bench. At that time he was sitting in Morris County.
Mm-hmm. But he didn't enter the race until relatively late in the primary season. Were you getting pressure to back other candidates, or were you decided to sort of sit it in terms of an endorsement in the primary? I
was not pressured by anybody. I believe, I really am not certain about this, but I think that Dick Coffey may have been a candidate in that primary, or at least talked about being a candidate in that primary. He was very friendly with Matty Feldman, and the only conversation I can recall about other candidates other than Brendan was Dick and maybe the gentleman from Middlesex County, whose name escapes me at the moment, but he had been the political leader in the legislature in Middlesex County, whose name had been advanced.
When Brendan Byrne announced that he was going to resign from the bench and run for office, did you sort of contact the campaign, or were you contacted by campaign people as to what type of role you might play?
I was contacted, as well as a number of other legislators contacted, to be a kind of ad hoc group, because by that time we had 2 years, close to 2 years under our belt in the legislature, knew something about the issues that the new governor was going to have to face, and the belief was that we had some amount of information and attitude, certainly toward the direction in which the new governor ought to go, that he ought to know about. So yes, we were contacted. We did in fact meet with the governor and campaigned with him.
was this during the primary or after the primary?
We were called. We were called to help out. It was after the primary was over.
In the primary, one of his opponents was Anne Klein, who was viewed, I believe, as one of the most liberal candidates in the race, if not the most liberal candidates in the race. Your Assembly colleague, Byron Baer, was a very liberal member of the Assembly throughout his career and also later in the Senate. Did you sort of have conversations with Byron Baer about where he was going and whether Anne Klein was a more compatible candidate than Brendan Byrne in terms of your sort of ideological positions?
Well, let me answer that in two different ways. First, I can't recall the time when Byron and I ever talked about who we were going to support in one race or another. We went our independent ways. And insofar as Anne Klein was concerned, I didn't know her at all. And except for the fact that she came out of a League of Women Voters background. I think she was the state president of the League of Women Voters before coming into the legislature. And although I was not out of harmony with a lot of what she was talking about, I think she was particularly interested in social issues that seemed to be the focus of her campaign. I was looking for somebody to support who was electable. To me, that was equally important. I obviously would not support somebody that I was completely out of phase with on the issues, but nonetheless felt that she was not electable.
Was there a feeling within the party regulars also that it was too early for a woman to run for governor?
That may have been a subliminal feeling, but it was not articulated in any outward way.
Well, in that primary in 1973, surprisingly, Governor Cahill gets defeated for re-election by Congressman Sandman. What was your reaction? Were you surprised?
Not necessarily surprised, given the primary makeup of Republican voters. Sandman was a rather, I don't know if you'd call him an extremist in today's environment, but certainly for that period of time, he was out of the mainstream of the Cahill, Kane, DeCourt type of Republican. The primaries, unfortunately, ordinarily attract a small number of voters who are the activists, and the activists in the Republican Party at that time were the more conservative voters.
Now, given Congressman Sandman's nomination, did the Democrats then feel, well, this is a lock, we're going to win the general election easily?
I don't believe that that was the feeling. I think that we had a series of defeats over the years. If you look back before Judge Hughes, Governor Hughes was elected, you had a couple of Republican governors. I know that Bob Minor broke into that scheme of things, but one can never be certain in New Jersey what was going to happen at the gubernatorial level. You had a Minor, a Driscoll, and Hughes. People were going back and forth, so that there was no lock on any election at that level at that time.
Now, you said you were asked with other legislators to help the Byrne campaign after the primary. Who were your contacts, or who do you remember from the Byrne people?
Dick Leone was one of the primary ones. And I am trying to remember whether I had been contacted by Luke Hayden, who became the governor's counsel, but they would have been the key players in the matter.
Did you get a feel for what positions they were sort of going to take on the major issues like broad-based tax? In
the course of the campaign, and this may have been already in the general election campaign. I can recall vividly the speech that Governor Byrne made, in which he said that that there would be no income tax advanced by him for the foreseeable future. Now, those words, foreseeable future, turned out to be a rather short period of time. But I cringed when I heard that, because it was contrary to everything that we knew about what those of us who have been through the first couple of years of legislative activity felt strongly was going to be needed.
Did you argue to Brendan Byrne or Dick Leone or other key people that they should take a more forthright position on a broad-based tax?
I don't know, because after our first few meetings of the legislators with then Judge Byrne, we really didn't have that much direct personal contact with him to be in a position to say, you're making a mistake here. So we were essentially out of the loop. They were running their own campaign, and I think that Jim Dugan out of Hudson County was very active in putting together the winning campaign strategy. And I suspect that his influence and others of a similar practical background were telling him to low-key the issue of taxation.
What about your own campaign? Did you take flack for your tax position?
No, well, I took flack obviously from my opponents, but insofar as voter groups or anything like that is concerned, very little. I got a lot more flack for other issues later on.
Did you publicly disagree with the Byrne position that the no tax was immediately needed in your campaign?
In my campaign, I both in my first campaign in '71 and in the '73 campaign at the time Byrne was running, I stated unequivocally what I felt about the tax problem.
Was there any effort from the Byrne campaign for you to sort of keep it quiet down? We're taking a position that is somewhat inconsistent with your own position.
No, because I think in their heart and soul they knew darn well that what I was saying was ultimately something that we were going to have to face up to.
Okay. Now, you mentioned Dick Leone and Lou Caden. After Governor Byrne's election in November, who were the other people that you came to know as sort of part of the new Byrne team?
Well, it was Jerry English, Cliff Goldman in the Treasury Department, and I think that that core group was the group that and Don Land to some extent, who was in the Secretary of State's office. I think that core group were the people that I came to know best of all. And there were some others like Joe Hoffman, who I think was in the Labor Department. But it was that key group that I came to work with in a number of legislative matters.
Did the communication that you said sort of fell off during the general election campaign with the Byrne campaign people improve after the election? Was there more consultation with the Democratic Legislative Caucus?
I think that it would be fair to say that the communication between the executive after Byrne took office and legislative leadership left a lot to be desired. There was a strain, whatever the reason was, between the two cohorts that lasted for a fair couple of years, I would say. But on the personal level, I was able to establish a very good working relationship with several of the cabinet people. And as a matter of fact, one of the first major pieces of legislation that the new governor wanted to push through was gubernatorial campaign financing. And I had introduced a bill in my first term relating to that very subject. So when the Byrne administration came in, and Bob Raymar, who was an assistant counsel at the time, he and I worked a little bit together on fashioning a different approach, but nonetheless the fundamental idea of advancing the gubernatorial campaign bill that eventually became law. I became the introducer of it, prime sponsor of it, and worked with Bob to explain it to the press and to the public.
Of course, helped by Watergate and the Cahill administration's problems, the Democrats have an overwhelming legislative victory in that November 1973 election. Talk about the sort of organization of the leadership and your personal role and who was who.
We did have an overwhelming victory as a result of Watergate, I would have to say. I think we had 66 Democrats and 14 Republicans in the Assembly, and a lesser margin in the Senate, but nonetheless comfortable enough. Out of huge majorities comes discord, because you have just too many people coming from their own little backgrounds and their own agendas, and it's like herding cats. Very difficult to get people in line on a series of issues that the governor feels is important. So it was not easy to have leadership put in place that could maintain effective control. On the personal level, there was a leadership fight that developed in which I was a participant. And because there were a few people who thought that I should be in leadership, they had been kind enough to advance my name. As I say, I did not know Brendan very well at that time. And he did not ever tell me directly, please get out of the leadership fight. But there was a combination being put together which included Howard Woodson, the minister from Trenton, as the speaker, and I think it was John Horn as the majority leader. I don't recall anymore. I know John was our floor leader in 72 and 3, but also Joe LaFonte was in that scheme of things as majority leader. And matters went back and forth, a lot of newspaper talk about the fighting going on within the Democratic Party, which in actuality is one of the more interesting features of Beacon public life and in political life, trying to put together a majority of your own party if you wanted to advance into a leadership position. I was not very effective in doing that, and as a result I lost out and became chairman of the Education Committee instead.
Well, you had demonstrated, as with your tax position, a certain degree of independence from positions of the Byrne campaign. Do you think that part of the reason for the leadership result was the new administration wanting people that they felt would be more their people?
There may have been an element of that in the ultimate calculation as to who they wanted to see in leadership. I think as well the very fact that Hudson County played a significant voting role in pushing Byrne into the governorship, that there was some feeling of obligation amongst, and I'm hypothesizing, nobody ever told me this, but it's simple common sense, that there was a sense of obligation to Dugan from Hudson County and whatever the other county leadership was there to go along with their suggestions.
And of course, I believe Governor Byrne has said publicly, and including in his interview in this series, that without that Hudson County backing, he probably would not have entered the race to begin with.
That probably is true. I think that certainly was a significant factor at that time. So my own hypothesis, I think, proved itself out.
Well, now that the legislature is organized, you've started a new term with a new governor. What were the things that were on your plate at this point?
On my plate, the primary thing had to be the matter of the education system and the court fights over education finance. And it wasn't just education, but rather the financial side that was interwoven with implementation of an education program. That probably exhausted 50 to 60% of my legislative time. There was other things that I became interested in. I also served on the Election Law Revision Commission, which was then in existence, which had been studying Title 19 of the election laws, and that became a pet project of mine. So that was another phase of work that I was doing. And I also was doing a fair amount in connection with internal matters, like the reorganization of our committee structure. In the 72-3 session of the legislature, John Horn asked me to write up a reorganization of the committee structure, which I did. And that was carried through with rules into the 74-5 session of the legislature. So I was pretty much preoccupied with those various items.
On the tax issue, you had a new governor who, to your chagrin, had come out in the campaign saying there was no need immediately for a broad-based tax. How did you deal with that? And did you try to persuade people within the administration that there was some way to try to change that position?
Well, in the intervening time between the general election and Governor Burns swearing in, I believe there was the first of a series of Supreme Court decisions in the case of Robinson v. Cahill. That was the first education finance case to hit the judiciary. Later became Abbott versus Burke, which we deal with even today. So with Robinson versus Cahill, I didn't have to say very much. The court had spoken. And early in the new governor's administration, to his great credit, he put together a team of people who began working on meeting the court mandate. And that included a couple of the people I mentioned before, Dick Leone specifically, Cliff Goldman, and there may have been others who came onto the scene to help out in various ways. But that was the beginning of a 2.5-year process, or actually a 2-year process, that led to the adoption of the Education Act in 1975, which included Steve Wiley, who was my counterpart as the Senate Education Committee chairman, and it included people on the outside like Ernie Rioch from Rutgers, who provided enormous help to us. And it was that team of people that had a great deal to do with moving forward on the court decisions.
Before we go further into the tax fight, let's take a short break.
Okay.
Al, we're now in the early months of the Byrne administration in 1974, and you've spoken about the impact of the Supreme Court's decisions in the series of school finance cases. Take us a little bit further in the story in terms of the court's decision, the impact on the legislature, and the reaction, I guess, to this sort of judicial mandate that the legislature do something about school finance in New Jersey.
It was a very intense, high-pressure time, and I can't recall ever having the kind of exhaustion, physical exhaustion, that I did during that approximately 18-month period during which we were attempting to come up with some solutions. And the reason for it was that we really started with a clean slate. And I recall being in the treasurer's outer office one day for a meeting at the very beginning of all this, before we had one word on a piece of paper, at which, as I mentioned earlier, Dick Leone and Cliff Goldman, I believe, was there, and a couple of other staff people, and Steve Wiley and myself. And we started with, I think, a chalkboard, or at least a pad, in which we began, all of us with suggestions to make of the path to follow in trying to meet the court decision. How do we go about reconfiguring not only the education system, but also the finance side, which was so critical to the implementation phase? Because the court, both then and later, after it became the L.L.C court, were quite prescriptive in what they felt the new system ought to show, so that it wasn't as though we had to wallow around in the mud and try to come up with some answers. They told us where there were deficiencies in New Jersey's educational system, and our task was to figure out how to get there.
In retrospect, the court's focus on dollar equivalency in terms of equalizing school spending in New Jersey, again, with the benefit of hindsight and many years, was that a mistake, or were there other approaches that might have resulted in a better system today?
We didn't start out with the objective of having fiscal equivalency. The constitutional mandate of a thorough and efficient public education didn't mandate that. It provided that we should afford every child in the state exactly what the Constitution said, thorough and efficient education. Now, there were other educational decisions, one in particular that I read that was authored by the then Chief Justice Weintraub, in which he pointed out that equivalency was not really a constitutional necessity, that if you applied what was the theory of equal protection, New Jersey's equivalent of the Equal Protection Clause of the Federal Constitution, to the problems that were arose out of unequal education, that the same principle could apply to the inequalities in police protection, in fire services, in all the municipal services that are characteristic of the cities as opposed to the suburbs. And they didn't want to go that route. They stayed away from the Equal Protection Clause. And inherent in that idea was that you didn't have to have an exact equality in the dollars spent per student in the poor districts as opposed to the wealthier districts. That was a concept that came later on.
But you had to demonstrate, quote, a thorough and efficient education, close quote, in the districts that the court had held were not getting that T&E education, T&E experience at that point. And that sort of is a performance measure as opposed to a dollar measure, at least a performance measure in terms of student performance. How do you come about it other than sort of looking at the dollars spent?
You come about it by testing the students because essentially what you're talking about in educational jargon are the outcomes. So there had to be, at different points in the educational process from K to 12, tests, given uniform tests to the student bodies to see how they fared. To nobody's surprise, those in the urban areas fared far worse than those in the suburban areas. Now, that was the first wave of reform where we boosted up the amount of money going into the urban districts, but still a pretty good distance away from actual equality. The equalization in dollar terms that ultimately affected what we call the Abbott districts, approximately 30 municipalities, with the wealthiest districts in the state, came as a result of decisions out of the L.L.C court.
In the early days of sort of trying to throw out as many ideas in this small group including the Byrne administration's key people in the Treasury. Were there other approaches that got some fair hearing? Was there talk about possibly going in a different path to, say, restructure the systems, forced merger of urban, suburban school districts, county-wide districts, more things that were aimed towards structure than they were towards spending?
Everything was on the table. It included different types of structures, some of which had already been tried in other parts of the country. So it wasn't as though we were closing our eyes to other possibilities. But when you took a careful look at those alternatives, which included coalescing some of the multitudes of school districts that we have in New Jersey, or going to a county-wide system as the state of Maryland had for a historically lengthy period, we found that not only was it difficult to do politically, but it may not, in the last analysis, give you the outcomes that you were looking for. Maryland doesn't have the greatest set of outcomes of their students. When you look at it from a graduation rate standpoint, a dropout standpoint, none of the normal indicia used for comparative purposes come strikingly at you when you take a look at other structures. So structure by itself really was no answer, at least we didn't think so.
And was the political assessment also based on the fact that New Jersey, as it continues today, has one of the most segregated school systems in terms of geography of any state in the country, and trying to force sort of regional or county-wide merger of school districts would be violently opposed on racial grounds?
We did not use as a barometer the concept of desegregation as one of the tools for achieving what we felt the court wanted to achieve. Obviously, conscious segregation, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, the Supreme Court's seminal decision told everybody that wrongful discrimination would not be tolerated any longer throughout the country. But natural discrimination still exists. And when I say natural, simply the force of residency and the use of residential components in allocating students to schools and necessarily end up in some places in a segregated school system still. And that we did not undertake to try to change. It was a monumental problem, still is.
And the court itself, in its decisions, really hadn't given that as an option, had it?
No, it had not.
Do you think that was, again, a mistake, or was that just sort of realistic politics?
I have to believe it to be realistic, because the problems of implementing even the most basic of changes were monumental in themselves. To get a new finance system in place, huge problem, as we saw when we had to have the schools closed for the state to adopt an income tax in 1976. So to have an overlay of desegregation as a prime factor in what we were doing would have, even though perhaps in the idealistic sense the right thing to do, was not part of our charge.
Apart from the income tax, were there other broad-based taxes that were considered?
Yes. We had several discussions about the possibility of having a statewide real property tax, the money from which would be allocated for educational purposes only. And that was a system that I think, in retrospect, probably would have been the most fair system of raising money for education, because areas that really weren't carrying their own tax burdens were in effect getting away with the raising of money for educational purposes that others were doing in effect for their local benefits.
Al, the statewide property tax, just how would that work?
There would be a fixed assessment statewide affecting all properties. Let's assume that it's $1 per 100.
Rolling.
Al, describe the workings of a statewide property tax.
Let's use this hypothetical. To begin with, properties are assessed at different levels through each municipality's assessor. They're required to reassess periodically, but certainly in the urban areas, they don't do that with the frequency that the statute requires. But there is something called the director's ratio of taxation. That tends to equalize on a statewide basis assessments of properties. Now, with that director's ratio, you would then set a tax such as, for an example, $1 per 100 of taxation on an assessed valuation of property. Collect that money into the state pot, assign that for educational funding. And that was one of the ways in which you can level off those areas that really were not carrying their educational burden as against those areas where the burden was enormous.
Now, you say in retrospect that might have been a fairer system. Why was it discarded at the time?
It was discarded because it was very difficult to get the idea across that another real property tax on top of what people already were paying, just as today that's a major issue, would have been politically impossible to get passed.
And it also would have affected different types of taxpayers, wouldn't it?
It certainly would. And I also believe, if memory serves, that there had been discussion about a statewide real property tax for educational purposes either in the early part of the Cahill administration, starting in '69, or even before that in the Hughes administration, and similarly discarded.
In your recollection, what regions and counties of the state would have been winners and losers in terms of the statewide property tax?
It really was difficult to put it in terms of counties. I think it was more municipality by municipality comparison. And it's hard to say at this point who were winners and who were losers.
But it was ultimately decided that the income tax was, even with the difficulty of selling it to the public and in the legislature, more politically viable?
Yes.
And more practical?
More practical.
Okay. Well, bring us a little further along on the sort of path toward the income tax. What were the hurdles along the way and the failures and so forth?
If you'll recall, the first tax program that was attempted to be passed, offered by the income tax program offered by the Bergen administration, came somewhere in 1974 or 5. I don't recall now exactly which year it was introduced, and that was based on more like the federal system of income taxation than the system that was ultimately adopted. And that went through several modifications with regard to rates and impact, and also what kind of tax package surrounding the basic income tax would be required. It didn't work. It barely got through the Assembly, went over to the Senate, and died in the Senate.
Who were the key people on the opposing side of the fence, both within the Democrats and the Republicans?
On the Democratic side, there were a number of people who didn't stick with the Bergen program. I don't recall the numbers now. Maybe other colleagues of mine you're going to interview would be far more adept at that. But the Republicans were almost unanimously opposed.
Was one of the problems that you had such a large majority, at least in the Assembly, that people didn't feel the discipline of having to sort of back the administration and the party line? As
I said earlier, when you have a huge majority such as we had in that 74-75 term, it's very difficult to maintain the discipline required to face up to as hot button an issue as adoption of an income tax. Very difficult.
You also had the problem that you had a governor who had sort of come across at least equivocal in his campaign in terms of the income tax, sort of changing his position very shortly after he was inaugurated, so that led to issues of credibility, I guess, both within the party and with the public at large.
There's no question that Governor Burns' credibility, insofar as that issue is concerned, suffered from the fact that he had made that inopportune promise during the course of his campaign. But I think that, wholly aside from any promise that the governor might have made, that really wasn't the driving force that kept a lot of Democrats from voting for his version of an income tax. It was largely the response to local pressures. And there were certain regional newspapers that were pounding away at several of our members on an almost daily basis. And they were very sensitive to the fact that if they were going to vote for that program, they were serving their last term in office.
On the Republican side, who were the key players?
There were none. On the Republican side, there were, they really had an absence of effective leadership. I don't recall whether Tom Kean was the minority leader at that period or not. He was at some point there. But the makeup of the Republican minority was such that they just wanted to sit back and watch the Democrats stew in their own juice. They were not going to help out. They were not going to advance any other solutions. The only thing that I can recall where the Republicans paid some attention was on the education bill itself, not the tax bill, but the Chapter 212 of the Laws of 75, because I conducted several seminars which included Republicans to try to explain what T&E was about, how we proposed in the education side of meeting the court mandate. And there were Republicans in good numbers attending those meetings, and we had Republican votes for the adoption of Chapter 212.
Let's break now to change tapes. Al, before our brief break, you spoke about the Republican side. Was there reluctance to sort of help at all with at least 1 or 2 or 3 votes on the tax issue? Also, feeling that the Democrats were so much in charge of the legislature that this was really your ball to carry over the goal line?
I'm sure that the fact that they were in such a hole as a minority, that they looked upon this as their way of stepping into the majority status at some future election. As a result, if I were in their shoes, I would have laid back myself and wait for the other side to make its mistakes. And that's precisely what they did.
How about the Republicans who had voted for the Cahill plan previously? Were any of them still around at
Tom
this point?
Kean was. Tom was around. I can't recall whether Gene Raymond was or not, but there were just a handful. Moose Ferran was around. I think Moose had voted for the Republican, for the Cahill tax program. But there were only 9 altogether, so Dick DeCourt by that time had died, and I don't recall anybody else from the Republican side that had been with Cahill who voted with the Democrats.
And of course, some of the tax opponents took the position that the Supreme Court had overstepped its jurisdiction and also had intruded into the sort of turf of the legislature in the specifics of the decisions on school finance. How did you deal with that, and did you have some sort of sympathy for that position that the court was going a little bit far in terms of providing a very specific legislative approach by court order?
I always felt that was a specious argument, And it was specious because what the court had found was so evident, namely that there was such a vast disparity in the financing by the state of our public school systems as between the poorer districts and the wealthier districts, that it was hard to make a rational argument against that proposition. And the statements that the court was overstepping its bounds always was premised on the fact that the legislature should be allowed to perform its duty and make its own decisions about this. The trouble was, if you would let the legislature have its way, it would never act upon it. You needed that stimulus from the courts in order to have the legislature respond, because it was a difficult decision for many legislators.
Now, the Byrne administration loses its first attempt to get the tax passed. What was your discussion within the legislature after that, and also to the extent you sort of discussed it with the Byrne administration people and the governor himself as to what to do next?
The attitude in the governor's office at that point, I think, was reflected a sense of discouragement. They had put a lot of effort, as we all did, into trying to get the legislature to adopt the tax package to implement the education bill. And I believe that their attitude at that time was, the ball is in your court. You didn't want my package, come up with another one. So we sat down, and I don't recall now whether we had casual meetings, but there were groups of us within the assembly side, where the bill had to start anyway, who began speaking in terms of what kind of alternative package we can put together. And we had staff that helped us out enormously. Gil Deerdorf. Thank you. At least I remembered half. Gil Deerdorf helped us with a number of elements of possibilities. And we had to take into consideration some of the suggestions that have been made by a number of the legislators as to what would sweeten the pot if we were to adopt an income tax. And as a result of those discussions, we came to the conclusion that we had to have some kind of a homestead rebate. We had to have a cap. We had to have a cap on educational spending. There had to be a series of things, I don't have them all at fingertips right now, that would attract people who might be willing to cast their vote for a tax, provided they had something to go along to show the voter that there were other things we were trying to do to help ease their financial burden.
Was there also a feeling that this had to be viewed as a legislative initiative as opposed to a Byrne administration initiative, given the impact on the Byrne credibility that had occurred by the failure of the first tax program?
If you recall, Brendan Byrne was not the most popular man walking the streets at that time. It was the end product of the credibility issue that you raise. And the fact that Brendan was not yet the accomplished speaker in public that he became later on in his administration and after he left office. So the public vision of the governor in 1975 and 6 was not what you would call very favorable. And the slogan that still rings through, I'm sure, the governor's head is one-term Byrne. That's what people were saying. So yes, to come back to your original question, there was, I guess, if not openly articulated, a decision that we had to distance ourselves from the governor's program and come in with a legislative program of our own.
But I assume there was still quite a bit of back-channel communication with Dick Leone, Cliff Goldman, the other people within the administration who knew the numbers and who could get you help in getting more numbers and putting your own package together.
No question. What I just described was the surface. Behind the scenes, we had actually whatever help we needed.
And in terms of the sort of plummeting public credibility and also the credibility of the Byrne administration within the legislature at that time, to what extent was it also a failure of communication, both publicly and with the legislative leadership? I mean, there has been talk that the Byrne people were arrogant, were aloof, were not the types of people that the legislature was used to dealing with.
There is more than a germ of truth in that. I think there were strained relations between the executive branch and the legislative leadership throughout these several years that we were dealing with the most difficult issues. And that did not help in resolving the issues. But even while that was going on, there was still a great deal of communication between the branches. There had to be. You couldn't do this in a vacuum. The legislature couldn't act in a vacuum, neither could the governor's office. And as a result, we kept our ties going. And it paid off in the end, obviously, but it took a great deal of effort on the part of a lot of people to bring the matter to a successful conclusion.
Let's again go back to that process. You have another court decision setting a deadline. And talk about that and the impact within the legislature.
There was a resentment, of course, in the legislature. But you have to put that in the context of the several court decisions that led up to that deadline by the Hughes Court. And that was that they gave signals in almost every one of their opinions. The Supreme Court had about 6 or 7 different opinions that were rendered in Robinson v. Cahill, let alone what happened later in Abbott versus Burke. But in the Robinson-Cahill, you can see where Justice Hughes, as an example in the few opinions that he wrote, was sensitive to the legislative prerogative and paid deference to it almost on each occasion when he wrote an opinion saying, now you got to do this and you have such and such amount of time to do it in because we have rendered a fundamental decision that the system is inadequate and unconstitutional. But the court at that point had lost patience when they saw that the Byrne package was defeated and the difficulty that we had, even though we had adopted the Chapter 212 of 75, and the court looked at that and said, well, facially it looks as though it can pass muster, there was still the financial side to come to grips with. And when the legislature missed one deadline after another, and the court set a new deadline as of July 1st, I guess it was, 76. Although there was griping, by any rational evaluation of what had gone on leading up to that point, the court was right to do what they did. And I recall also that there was in one of those opinions, and maybe even the opinion that set the deadline of July 1, where Justice Pashman wrote a dissenting opinion in which he advocated that the treasurer of New Jersey be directed by the court not to send any money, any state tax money, to the wealthy districts of the state, but to concentrate all money collected by the state in the so-called, what then became the Abbott districts. So that raised the hackles even further, even though it's just a dissenting opinion.
Give us some of your memories of those hectic days after or as you approached the July 1st deadline and after.
Well, there was not very much sleep that was available to us. Around the same time as the July 1st deadline, the Republicans initiated an effort in the federal courts to have the federal courts step in and direct the state to keep the schools open and to grant a stay that would have prevented us from implementing the thorough and efficient clause of our Constitution. Well, that brought additional tensions to the fore, and it was only after that the federal court sitting en banc, the full complement of judges, in other words, of the federal New Jersey system, ruled in denying and dismissing the Republican effort, with only Fred Lacey and Herbert Stern dissenting in that group, that the attention was solely focused on getting a tax passed. And those days, as I mentioned before, were some of the most stressful that I can recall going through, because there was lack of sleep, there were pressures, and on top of that, after the Assembly acted to pass what ultimately became the gross income tax at a 2% level that was sponsored by Speaker Hamilton, that I played something of a role in negotiating with Joe Merlino, the majority leader of the Senate, in trying to get them to act promptly and get the votes lined up, the 21 votes needed in the Senate to pass the bill that we had already passed. And that in itself was a stressful venture. I can recall, just quickly anecdotally, I think we were holed up at the hotel. I don't think it's there any longer, but in any event, we were the Assembly leadership was gathered at this hotel across on State Street.
Old Holiday Inn.
I don't recall anymore. And I walked from there into the State House corridors to lead to the Assembly chamber, to the Senate chamber, where the senators were, the Democratic senators were all gathered. And I had to prop myself up against the wall because I was so utterly exhausted. And then coming to the Senate door, and I knocked, and Merlino sticks his head out, and I say, I want to explain what we have done and why you should do it, and he wouldn't let me in. He would not let me into the Senate caucus. He said, nobody comes into the Senate caucus.
Who were the swing votes, both on the Democratic side, and what Republicans did you have some hopes of co-opting?
In the Assembly?
Yeah.
Littell was a Republican vote, and there may have been one other. I don't recall. Carl Weidel, that's right.
And was there a role you played in trying to both secure Democratic votes or solicit Republican votes, or was that a role for others?
No, that was a role for others primarily.
And describe, I guess, the day of the votes and sort of your personal reaction, and what was the sort of feeling within the chambers?
Well, the feeling amongst those of us who were the proponents of the adoption of the gross income tax, they were euphoric because so much effort had gone in over a period of at least 4 years, pretty close to 4 years, I should say, that to see it finally come to fruition really was a feeling of pleasure and combined with exhaustion that goes along with a major effort of this sort. Probably overpleased because it was no magic answer to what was needed, but nonetheless it was an answer, a legislative answer.
And were there some legislators who knew that by voting for the tax they were ending their legislative careers?
There were a handful, a couple of them, yeah.
And how did you sort of feel about that in terms of their personal positions, or was that something you felt that they just had to deal with on their own?
Well, at the personal level, you hate to see anybody who you think does the right thing suffer political defeat as a result of it. One of those who went through that very trauma was Herb Klein. Herb became a friend in addition to being just another colleague in the legislature. But he was from the Clifton area. He was pilloried every day by the local Clifton newspaper, or the Passaic County newspaper. And his vote eventually came to adopt the income tax, and he was defeated.
After the tax was passed, what was the next thing you had to worry about in the legislature? Obviously, sort of the implementation, the mechanics of the program. to a large extent they were the administration's problem, but what was the other sort of remaining agenda for the legislature? I assume there was also some feeling of relief that you wanted just to rest after this intense battle.
Well, it was certainly true that we were not looking for any more tax fights. That went without saying. The other issues that remained on the plate and on the governor's agenda, among others, were environmental issues, because we were still to face the Pinelands Preservation Act as one major piece of legislation the governor wanted, as well as a couple of other environmental preservation laws. I think there were refinements to the Spill Act as well. Even though it was in place, there were things that had to be done with that. And there were other issues that were coming up, such as civil service reform, ethics reform, and things that the governor wanted to do comes the next term.
What about Atlantic City?
That was a major thing as well, of course. I omitted that from the list, but that certainly was an issue that we had a fight about. And I don't recall the timing of that exactly. I think it was in the beginning of the second term. But there was a lot of opposition to it. It had lost on referendum at one point. And to put it on for a second time, the same opposition, both religious and otherwise, to gambling and the expansion of gambling in the state was something that had to be overcome. Yet when you put that on the scale and took a look at, that is to say, the adoption of gambling, and looked at what was happening in Atlantic City, and also taking a look at the fact that tourism was New Jersey's major industry, and seeing how the decay along the shoreline was proceeding at an increasingly rapid rate, something had to be done about it. And nobody had any answers except for the fact that you could put gambling in there by referendum.
And that was the basis for your personal position in supporting the casino referendums. Now, at some point, you're approached about joining the Byrne administration. When was that, and how did that come about?
That was in 1975. I think past the middle of the year. In fact, it may have been right after the adoption of the Education Act of '75. That was in September. I was approached by the administration to take on the counsel's job. And I was giving it serious consideration. But after discussing it with a number of people, including some inside the administration, I decided against it. And I don't regret it. I would have enjoyed doing it. And Lord knows, looking back, there were a series of governor's council who ended up on the New Jersey Supreme Court. So maybe it was a terrible mistake on my part professionally. But I enjoyed my legislative life, and I really don't have any regrets.
Was this at the point when Lou Caden resigned as Governor Byrne's first counsel?
I was going to replace Lou Caden.
And of course, this is also a point where the Byrne administration is still pretty low in public credibility and approval ratings. Did that have some factor in that the governor's future political prospects did not look very promising?
It played a role because I had to look upon it at that point as being perhaps an 18-month job. And it certainly was in the mix of considerations that I reviewed before deciding not to do it.
Was there any suggestion, either directly or through intermediaries, that, well, if he lost, there was also the judgeship potential? As you pointed out, many councils had taken advantage of both before and after.
At that time, that was not a pattern that had yet developed. Caden didn't go on to the court. It was only in Governor Byrne's second administration that a number of vacancies took place, so that Dan O'Hearn, Stu Pollock, Alan Handler all went from the counsel's job into the Supreme Court's spot.
At least at the Supreme Court level, but there had been a
Yeah.
prior pattern of appointments to the Superior Court.
Oh, sure. But I had that opportunity early on. I had initially been offered the possibility of a Superior Court judgeship during the Gale administration.
So you didn't think a Superior Court appointment was sufficiently attractive to accept the counsel's position with the idea that that would lead to a Superior Court appointment?
Yeah, that was not part of my thinking.
Okay. And after the income tax, what sort of political discussions took place within the legislature about how you try to justify this decision in the oncoming elections, both in the legislative races and also in the gubernatorial race?
The patterns that we could see developing, one of which I've touched upon already, made for, I thought, a pretty powerful argument in favor of the income tax, because we were able to show at that point that certainly in the suburban areas of the state, people who worked in neighboring states, and that went for both Pennsylvania and New York, at opposite ends of the state, were going to benefit because of the credit they would get for the payment of tax to those other states. So to them, to that cohort of people, they were not going to be suffering. In fact, they would benefit. Additionally, it got the whole education issue out of the courts finally. And we were able to show that matters of education would now be dealt with as it had been for so long before, at the local levels and in a measured way. And it made for, I think, a very powerful argument.
Again, going back to preparing for the campaign on the tax, were your considerations to stay in the legislature, seek new leadership opportunities? What were your, or did you feel, well, you had done your bit in terms of the tax and the other initiatives you had taken on campaign finance and whatever? Were you sort of burned out at this point?
No. You recover, at least I was young then, so that you recover fairly quickly. And since I was on leadership track, I wanted to become the majority leader, and did become the majority leader in '77. And I felt that there were still things in my agenda, that legislative agenda, that I wanted to try to get through. So I was not yet at the stage where I felt there was repetitiveness setting in, boredom setting in, that I was becoming a less effective legislator. That had not yet happened.
What role did you take in the Byrne re-election campaign, both in the primary and in general?
Well, in the primary, there was a primary because a number of Democrats felt that what had happened with the programs that we've just been talking about made it perhaps possible for them to show their wares as leaders of the state, and they had a sense that Brendan was in a weak position and a vulnerable position politically. And I think he won the primary with perhaps 23% of the votes, something around there. I never hesitated for a moment in advocating his renomination, not for a moment.
Did you speak around the state or just in the district?
No, just in my area. I wasn't doing much speaking in other places.
Mm-hmm. What do you recall of the other candidates who opposed Governor Byrne's renomination?
I recall that they ran rather meretricious campaigns. I think that among them were, maybe I'm confusing the 77 with the 81, but I think that Pat Dodd was running in that primary, maybe Joe Molino, I'm not sure. Maybe Molino was in the 81 campaign, and Florio.
Joe Hoffman also. Byrne
Oh,
cabinet
yes,
office.
Joe Hoffman ran, that's right, in that primary, yes.
Did you sort of feel a point where the election swung to Byrne's favor in the general election? I mean, he started off well behind Senator Bateman in terms of polls. What point was the swing of that campaign?
The swing was quite discernible, and it eventually proved itself out. But two things happened. First, there was a convergence of an illness that Ray Bateman suffered that kept him away from campaigning for perhaps a week, something of that sort. And it came at a critical time in the campaign because Brendan was beginning to turn people around. I recall his coming to Bergen County, and I was out campaigning with him. And as we walked down the streets of the shopping areas, people were giving friendly greetings to him. And you could tell that things were beginning to change. They were beginning to listen to what he had achieved in his first term in office. And as a result, he carried our area by a pretty significant margin.
Also, there was, I guess, the media and public reaction to the Bateman-Simon alternative program.
Yeah.
Were you involved in developing the response to the Republican plan?
No, that was primarily done by the in-house Byrne campaign people.
Mm-hmm. But from the outside, did you feel that was extremely effective in getting that message out, that the Republicans really did not have a realistic alternative?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we were able to use that in our campaign. People sensed that it was a phony, and that their alternative was no alternative at all.
Now we get to the general. Governor Byrne gets reelected, surprisingly, given the sort of rocky path since his shift on the tax position and the enactment of the income tax. And we have a new organization, I guess, of the legislature to talk about those days in terms of both your personal and the institutional sort of positions that were up for grabs.
Well, I became the majority leader, and it wasn't the best couple of years of my life, but nonetheless, there were some fractious portions of our reduced majority, but nevertheless significant majority in the 1977 campaign. But I'm not sure that was my my métier, you might say, in the legislative life, even though I felt that it was something that I wanted to do and could do. But there were a number of critical issues and controversial issues that the administration began to be interested in, and it was not easy keeping together a majority of the Democrats to go along with the Byrne program. Now, part of it was the matter of the Pinelands that I mentioned before. There was a lot of South Jersey resistance among the Democrats, and if you combine them with the resistant Republicans, that faced a very difficult path. But I went down on a trip just to see what it was like to go on the land itself, and there was a helicopter trip that was also taken, and it left such an impact on me that this vast area, which was so sensitive ecologically, could become part of the preservation area for the state, and I became a real advocate for it. But it was a tough time, as I say, keeping a majority in place in order to get it adopted.
And I think you said in another interview that you really knew very little about the Pinelands before you took this trip.
That's quite so, quite so. And we were guided, of course, by some of the locals going through the area, and it was a dramatic. It had a dramatic impact upon me.
Did anyone, including you, argue to the Byrne administration people or to the governor himself that this was a fight he really didn't need to take, that you had already suffered some bruising battles with the tax program, and that politically the Pinelands wasn't really high on the agendas of even the environmental groups at that time.
No, I never took that position, never told the governor that he should back off on that issue. I felt increasingly strongly that this was something that he should follow through on. And I think in retrospect, when I talked to him later on at the conclusion of his second term in office, of the thing that he felt most comfortable with and most proud of, and he mentioned the Pinelands Preservation Act.
But as you suggested, he put a lot of the Democrats, particularly from that region, who had been in swing districts, who had kept their seats even despite of the tax position. Maybe some of them actually were not on the voting for the tax, but some of them were politically at risk by his Pinelands initiative, weren't they?
Yes, they certainly were. And you come to the proverbial balancing act. Do you worry about the preservation of your seat or the preservation of the environment? And every legislator comes across issues where he's going to get heat. And if you can't stand it, as Harry Truman said, get out of the kitchen. I sponsored a civil service bill for the administration. And one of the parts of that bill had to do with cutting out the absolute veteran benefits. In other words, if you were a veteran, took a test, passed the threshold number of 70, I think it was, that they had as their standard, irrespective of somebody got 99, you got 70, the veteran got the job. Made no sense. And every other state that we took a look at all had a point benefit to the veteran, but not an absolute benefit. But I had veterans walking in front of my house, walking in front of my campaign headquarters in 1979, threatening me with all kinds of imprecations, even though they may never have heard a shot fired in anger and I had been in the infantry. Didn't make any difference.
In Governor Burns' second term, most of the key players changed. Bob McKay became Chief of Staff. Harold Holis was his deputy. You had new counsels, I guess Stu Pollock may have been at the beginning of the second term. Did the communication improve with the legislature?
I think so, yes. To begin with, the people that the governor chose in the counsel's office were just wonderful to work with. They not only were they smart, but they were also nice, decent personalities that could relate to the people in the legislature that they had to persuade with regard to the administration program as never before. I think they were far better in that respect. I mean, Luke Hayden was a very, very bright guy, but he was not a communicator. But Stu Pollock collared me one day and puts his arm around my shoulder and says to me, "You're just the guy I was looking for. Here's the civil service bill." Well, little did I know the trap I was walking into. But they were just wonderful people. So the communications did improve, and Brendan got used to his job in a way that led to a much easier association with legislative leadership than ever before.
And somewhat ironically, the job that you turned down as counsel after Luke Hayden left went to Alan Handler, who then was appointed to the Supreme Court before Governor Burns' re-election. Did you have some sort of feeling of, gee, I sort of blew that one and that could have been me?
No, as I say, I never looked back on that. No, I made my decision, that was it. Maybe yes, maybe no. I heard at one time that my name, even before Alan got on the court, had been submitted with 4 or 5 others for a Supreme Court nomination that had opened up before. And I don't really recall when that was. But no, the fact that I didn't take the available stepping stone was something, sure, to some extent you might have some regrets, but I also enjoyed what I did.
Let's run us through the rest of the second term and your role and the key people and issues you remember.
Yeah, in the second term, after going through the majority leadership was one set of circumstances in which I had my rocky moments there. But when it came time, one of the things that I wish to point out, Alan Karcher, unfortunately now deceased, was a kind of a renegade Democrat. He was against the income tax. He and George L.L.C. from Middlesex County worked as a pair, were against the first burn program, were against the education program, and I believe also voted against the gross income tax. But Alan had an enormous depth of understanding about the institution of the legislature, and I felt that he was somebody that ought to be in leadership. So when I became the majority leader, I went to see the governor. And of course, Alan had been taking pot shots at Governor Bergen ever since he took office. And I knew that I was going against the grain of normal human reaction when I said to the governor that I think Alan ought to be brought into leadership, that he is going to be effective, and try to tout him as much as I could. And to Governor Bergen's credit, he said to me, if you think that he's going to be that sort of benefit, you go ahead and do what you want. So I brought Alan into the leadership, and it was the best, smartest move I ever made. Now, later on, even though he replaced me as the majority leader in the 79-81 term, I never held that against Alan as such. Because the anticipation was somewhat a little different. Jackman was the speaker, and the thought was that I would take over Jackman's spot, but that thought was in my mind and not in the majority of the other minds. So through the balance of that time, I began again to focus on education issues, because there were a lot of problems in the implementation of Chapter 212. The education commissioner was Fred Burke, not a very effective education commissioner. And the balance of my career was largely devoted to that, to changing special education, because that was facing some problems, and that really was the capstone to the career.
Mm-hmm. And then sort of bring us through the rest of your legislative career and your sort of personal decision-making in terms of your ultimate political and private career.
I ran in the Democratic congressional primary in 1978 and lost. And that persuaded me that I was not a very good politician. Mm-hmm. I like dealing with issues, and I guess today I'd be called a policy wonk, maybe. I'm not even sure about that. But having lost to a weak opponent in the Democratic primary, which at that point was consisted of parts of Hudson County as well as Bergen, and I got killed in Hudson County, persuaded me that I really was not going to go to any higher political office, and as far as I was concerned, it was either up or out politically. And I was not necessarily interested in moving over to the Senate side. It'd be more of the same. I would have preferred to focus upon national issues, but that was not to be, and I calculated that was the end of the political career.
And privately, in your career as a lawyer and in your other roles in nonprofit and sort of government task forces and other positions, sort of bring us up to date as to what you've been doing more recently.
Well, I have been spending, in addition to obviously the practice of law, I became more active in groups and organizations that were law-related. But also I kept one tie to the legislative process. I became the chairman of the New Jersey Law Revision Commission when it was created in 1986 or 7, and was its chairman continuously thereafter until 2 months ago when I relinquished the chairmanship. I'm still on the commission, but I decided it was time to have new blood in the chairmanship. And that kept me current with various parts of the law that were going before the legislature and being able to make recommendations to changing big titles of the law, such as Title 19. Still not successful. The section on evidential issues that I became involved with, and other matters in the commercial law field that were the product of the Uniform Laws Commissions that we had to evaluate as part of the Law Revision Commission, kept me current with what was happening legislatively. Then I also became involved in an advisory Supreme Court committee on extrajudicial activity, and I have continued with that for the past 15 or 16 years, which deals with what judges can do off the bench. While they're still active on the bench and in retirement, there are certain guidelines, and there are always questions arising as to what is permissible, what is not permissible. And I was the only practicing lawyer on this advisory commission, but it gave me an opportunity to watch the judicial mind at work dealing with their own local problems.
We began this interview, and I think I asked you to sort of look back at New Jersey over the course of your professional and political career in terms of what was good and what was bad over that lifetime. And maybe that's sort of where we should also close a little bit. I mean, now, sitting here, June 6, 2006, possibly the apocalypse, what do you think are the major issues? I mean, some of them are the same things that you dealt with in the legislature in those days, that of unfinished business, but what are the main problems, and what do you think should be done about them?
The main problems continue to be providing an education for all children in the state that prepares them for the real world after they finish their formal education. We've made progress, but I can say from looking at what has been happening in the school systems that we still have an enormous distance to go. And the absence or lack of an adequate education has its impact upon crime rates, among other things, unemployment among a very important issue, so that it is central to improving the quality of life in the state. And we haven't arrived at that yet. It's not that we don't have some excellent school systems and excellent teachers in New Jersey. We do. We have some fine school systems. I happen to live in one of them, but they are sprinkled throughout the state. But it is still a question in the urban areas of improving the quality of education there. And there we've only marginally improved. So that's one major section where we've got to do something about it. The other, of course, is what you hear increasingly to the point of a din, has to do with real property taxation. What do you do about that? I see that there are proposals to have a constitutional convention. Some of it targeted at the thorough and efficient education clause of the Constitution. So that's the answer to our real property problems. I don't see it that way. And I think the issue has been studied to death. I do think that there has got to be a better balance in the overall tax scheme that we have. It is true that with an aging population in New Jersey, with people living longer lives in their own homes, that they're being forced out to some extent from their homes because the burden of real property taxation is very real. And as income declines or stabilizes once retirement occurs, it's a hurtful process for a person trying to make a go of it. And I do think that there has got to be a better balance among our major taxes, which include income tax, real property, and sales. And that's something that, as I say, has been studied to death. Proposals have been made. They're out there. And if the will to do something about it exists in the legislature, I think they could be doing a service for the state.
Any closing thoughts on Brendan Burns' place in New Jersey history?
When you look back over the spectrum of governors and what they accomplished since the adoption of the 1947 Constitution, I would have to rank Brendan Byrne as one of the most effective, if not the most effective governor in the state's history since that point began. And if you take a look at what was done by his two administrations in the way of legislative advancement, you can take the issues of environment that we've talked about, governmental ethics, the expansion and change in the civil service laws, which, although not adopted during Brendan's administration, the essence of his bill was adopted when Tom Kean took over as governor. There are a host of things that make a complete menu of what Brendan was able to achieve that I think warrants valuing him as one of our best.
Let's end there.
Thank you.
Thank you.